Hi, I'm Jonathan Crawford, founder of ArkTech-Perspectives. You know that moment when you realize that a conversation or discussion is turning into a conflict? Most people, whether consciously or automatically, react based on the fight or flight mechanism. Do you dig in and start arguing? Do you look to exit the conversation as quickly as possible, making an excuse to come back and deal with it later? Conflict is not inherently bad. In fact, in business, it is a powerful engine for progress when properly harnessed. But unmanaged conflict is a recipe for bigger problems. Maybe the conflict avoidance response results in lots of unproductive meetings or poor communication. Or worse, maybe the aggressive response to conflict results in broken team dynamics or the perception of a hostile work environment. Unmanaged conflict can be a huge liability for your business. But managed conflict can be the flywheel that accelerates your problem solving efforts and builds team chemistry. So, how do you overcome the autonomic fight or flight response? Learn to classify the type of conflict you're involved in. You see, classification is a form of cognitive categorization, which moves your thinking to a higher level in the brain. Take the steering wheel away from your amygdala and let the prefrontal cortex drive. It'll dampen that fight or flight reaction and empower you to respond in a manner better suited to the type of conflict. You'll be less emotional in your response and better able to deal with the conflict with a level head. Now, this isn't a change you can make overnight. Early on, your fight or flight response may kick in before you think to categorize the conflict, or a strong emotional reaction may suppress your ability to objectively consider the conflict. If you miss an opportunity to apply cognitive categorization in the moment, that's okay. Reflect on those missed opportunities and classify the conflict in retrospect. It will help train your brain to want to classify any conflict you encounter. And the more you practice, the faster your brain will respond to conflict by trying to categorize. You'll be astonished by the results. So now that you understand why classifying conflict is so powerful, let me take you through the taxonomy of conflict. One of the key things to realize is that there are really only four sources of conflict. The most common by far is a conflict of information. We see these all the time. This is where two or more parties have different information. Maybe one of them has more information than the other. Maybe one of them has wrong information. Typically, you see a lot of frustration with this type of conflict. You hear people talk about feeling like they're mushrooms kept in the closet and fed a steady diet of fertilizer. That's a sign you're in a conflict of information. And the great thing is, this is also one of the easiest conflicts to resolve. It's about sharing information. The most important thing you can do when you realize you've entered a conflict of information is to listen. Ask questions. Understand where the other person is coming from, and then offer additional information, context, clarification, and, where needed, correction. But keep it framed as an information exchange. It's not about who's right or who's wrong. It's about, hey, let's get on the same page. Let's compare notes and make sure we're making a decision or trying to work this out from the same perspective. The second common source of conflict is conflict of resources. Sometimes you get all the information, you're on the same page, and you realize, yes, but we both need the same thing or the same person. Very common when you're talking about budgets, when you're talking about staffing. Everybody's short-staffed and everybody needs that one more person. So the question is, who needs it more? And that's really the key to resolving a conflict of resources. With a conflict of resources, the first two steps are pretty simple. Acknowledge that you both have a need for the same resource, and acknowledge that that resource can't do both things at once. If you don't acknowledge those up front, you may think you've resolved the conflict, only to find out later that you're in an even worse situation. I've seen way too many circumstances where a resource was shared in a way that was really never going to work out. I worked for a company that made heavy use of matrix management. At one point, I was the lead or key engineer on 4 different projects at the same time, being managed by 3 different project managers. As it so happened, we had a crisis or looming deadline arise in each one of those projects in the same week, and all 3 project managers wanted my assistance. The overall executive refused to acknowledge the resource contention issue. In addition to 2 of the deadlines being missed, the lack of conflict management directly led to political infighting between the project managers. So the key is to first acknowledge what you're contending over and that resource isn't enough to satisfy both needs. Resolving the conflict of resources is about shifting into collaboration mode. Let's work together to understand our respective responsibilities and commitments, and let's see if we can't prioritize appropriately. Sometimes a real key is breaking up those big deliverables into increments. If you have a milestone deliverable that will scratch someone's itch pretty significantly, sometimes you can actually be very creative with the allocation of resources. Maybe nothing comes in exactly on time, or maybe one thing is delayed, but because the 80% mark is met, in some cases early, you actually have happier stakeholders. And for the stakeholders that are absolutely drawing a line in the sand, we've got to have this by Tuesday. You may need to take time to engage them in understanding what the competing priorities are. Stakeholders who listen and understand, and there are techniques to help you get them there, will generally accept a reasonable solution with minimal grumbling. Now, executives who have the authority and make the decision to change priorities may choose to flex their power, but it's worth reminding executive management that every time you change priorities, you lose another 20% in efficiency because of the context switching. When people have to stop what they were doing, hopefully keeping enough notes that they can pick it back up in a useful way later, and reacquaint themselves with the new thing that they've been pivoted to, it has a surprisingly large negative impact on productivity. Cornell and Harvard have both done studies on context switching and the impact on workplace productivity. Among some of the fascinating findings, employees lose 5 work weeks per year to context switching and can lose 10 IQ points to frequent context switching. The third source of conflict is the conflict of faith or belief. Now, this one's tricky. A lot of times you'll see this in social conversations, political conversations, religious conversations. What it really boils down to is different value systems. Let's take as a simple example, switching the kitchen straws from plastic straws to cardboard straws. Now, for one person, the environment may be so critical that they're willing to sacrifice a level of profit margin in order to protect the environment. But if they're in a conflict over whether or not to convert to cardboard straws with someone who doesn't value the environment the same way, but sees the budget or profit margins as sacrosanct, you have competing value systems, a conflict of belief. In a conflict of belief, you're not going to change either person's viewpoint. At the end of the day, faiths and beliefs are faiths and beliefs. So the first and most important step in resolving a conflict of belief is to openly point out the nature of the conflict and acknowledge the validity of the other person's beliefs and faiths. Remember, you don't have to agree with them to acknowledge them. The second step is to reframe the conflict to remove the conflict of belief. So going back to our conflict around straws in the kitchen, should the debate really be around plastic straws or cardboard straws? How many straws are we actually using? Do we need straws at all? Is there something else we could do? Why do we have straws in the kitchen? Are we providing cups? Could we encourage folks to bring their own? The company gives away water bottles. Those have straws. Why not just encourage folks to bring their water bottles? A lot of times, the trick with a conflict of faith or belief is to find a way to take the faith or belief collision out of the discussion. Because again, you're never going to be able to change each other's minds. In some cases, the only way to remove the conflict of belief from the situation is to remove one of the people from the situation. Now, the gentlest way can be to either accede, this is not a hill I'm willing to die on, go ahead, or offer to use a third party as an arbiter. I'm not sure this is a hill either of us wants to die on, but maybe we ask Sue what she thinks. If the conflict is petty enough, such as with the straws, or personal enough, such as with religious beliefs, usually one of the parties will accede as they realize that the belief is less important to them than it is to the other person. This is the real importance of explicitly identifying the conflict of belief, so that both people can realize that this will not be a matter of changing someone else's opinion. You cannot win a conflict of belief except by acknowledging it and allowing the stronger belief to prevail. Now, in some cases, resolving a conflict of belief involves removing a believer from the conflict. A friend of mine early in his career was asked to pour toxic chemicals down a sink drain. He knew this was not only unsafe but illegal, but as a new hire, he felt powerless to push back. He chose to resolve the conflict by leaving the company. If your beliefs aren't being acknowledged and respected within reason, then you may need to remove yourself from the conflict environment. Similarly, though, an employee who chronically uses personal beliefs as a trump card to block progress, not talking about personal beliefs that are protected by law, without any willingness to compromise or collaborate to find creative solutions, you may need to remove them from the conflict environment, either through reassignment or termination. Last but not least is the conflict of respect. Now, conflict of respect is rarely where things start. There are extreme cases, but generally speaking, conflicts of respect develop because of unresolved conflicts of the other types. What I mean by conflict of respect is where one of the parties is simply not bothering to listen or consider what the other person is saying. It may be the person who talks over you. It may be the manager or executive who's very quick to make the power move. I'm the boss, I'm making the decision. Okay, that's well and good if you've already had a discussion where everybody laid out the options and maybe you were at an impasse, folks couldn't decide. That is one valid way to resolve it, though in our communications perspectives workshops, we can teach you better ways to get there. But someone who does that right out of the gate, I don't want any discussion on this, this is what we're doing. There's conflict of respect inherent in that, because they've clearly decided that it doesn't matter what ideas you have or what opinions you have, theirs are better. That's a respect issue. To illustrate how to deal with a conflict of respect, I'll share the most egregious example I've ever seen of a conflict of respect. I had a client who knew they had made a mistake, but did not want to acknowledge it, wasn't willing to acknowledge it, was actually trying to blame us for something that was related to the mistake they had made. When I tried to tactfully bring up the context, they immediately began interrupting me, shouting me down. And so I did what I do in any conflict of respect. I said, I'm sorry, can you please stop interrupting me while I'm speaking? Can we have just at least a little professional respect? Now, 9 times out of 10, that works great. Pointing out that there's a professional respect aspect to this and doing it calmly helps the person realize maybe they're being a little over the top. In this case, the client's response was, no. He was not about to afford me any professional respect. At that point, I very politely declined to respond and to participate any further in the discussion. We had nothing further to discuss. In a conflict of respect, the only outcome until the respect is dealt with is capitulation. And capitulation is not a proper resolution of conflict. Now, maybe you decide it's a battle you don't need to fight, and that's fine. But keep in mind that it enables that person's disrespect for you. I have actually fired people who revert to conflict of respect. When someone is consistently disrespectful to their colleagues, their coworkers, their customers, that's unacceptable. We cannot succeed as an organization. We can't succeed as a team. And that's a terminable offense. By the same token, I've walked away from managers with whom there was a conflict of respect, because if the manager's not listening to me, then why did they hire me? How is my input and feedback benefiting the company or them if they don't have enough respect to actually hear it? My input doesn't have to be accepted, but at least hear it. So those are the 4 sources of conflict. The next time you find yourself feeling that fight or flight response because a conversation is starting to get testy, switch on the problem solver in your brain and say, what type of conflict is this? Go back to the strategies for each of those styles of conflict, each of those sources of conflict, and see if you can't defuse the conflict or convert it into a really productive session without feeling the heightened emotions, the adrenaline rush, and the need to fight or flight. For more information on this, and to dive in deeper and learn more techniques and examples for each of these, please contact us at sales@arktech.com or visit our website to learn more about our Communication Perspectives workshops. Thank you for listening.